After the revelation of their secret affair, Grace and Malik's lives changed forever. No one expected their relationship to become known, and now they find themselves in the midst of the devastating consequences of their actions. They both knew that they had made an irreparable mistake, and now they had to deal with the consequences. Grace felt an overwhelming sense of guilt. She destroyed her family, betrayed her husband and daughter, and lost the respect of people who were important to her. Her days were spent in agonizing thoughts about how things could have gone so far. It seemed that until recently everything was under control. Their affair was their personal secret, and now her life has fallen apart. Grace and George had been together for over 20 years. Their marriage seemed strong and stable, but the years have changed their relationship. At the beginning of their life together, everything was filled with passion and love. They traveled, often had dinners with friends, and enjoyed life. However, over the years, their communication was reduced to mundane things. They discussed household chores, work, problems with bills, but the emotional intimacy began to fade. It all started gradually. Grace didn't even notice how at one point their conversations became shallow. They had dinner together every night, but they only talked about what they needed to do next week: buy groceries, pay bills, do repairs. Their evenings together were increasingly spent in silence. George was sitting on the couch with a tablet or a newspaper, and Grace was trying to find solace in books or television shows. Sometimes they exchanged a few words, but these conversations were far from the deep conversations they enjoyed in their youth.
George, can you pick up the car from the repair tomorrow?
George nodded without taking his eyes off the TV screen.
Yes, I'll pick her up on the way home from work. And don't forget to buy milk. We're out of milk.
These short exchanges have become typical of their interactions. Grace often thought that they were missing something important: the spark, the emotional intimacy they once had. She noticed how the distance between them was growing. Although physically they remained close, George was always caring and devoted, but over the years their relationship became so routine that Grace began to feel lonely, even being in his presence. She often sat in the kitchen in the evenings, staring into a cup of tea, wondering where the emotions they once felt for each other had gone. It occurred to her that maybe they had just become old. But in her heart, she understood that it wasn't just age, something had really changed. One evening, after a particularly long and silent dinner, Grace decided to talk to George. She couldn't hold back her emotions anymore.
George, we haven't talked to each other for a long time. I don't mean talking about bills or repairs, I mean us. What do you think is going on?
George looked at her in surprise, as if he didn't fully understand the question.
What do you mean? We talk every day. We are together. We're fine, aren't we?
Grace felt a wave of disappointment rise in her chest. She didn't want to talk to George that way, but the words came out of her mouth.
Do you really think so? After all, we hardly communicate. We live together, but do you notice that we have become strangers? We don't talk about feelings anymore, about us. It all comes down to routine.
George paused, wondering what to say. He hadn't expected this turn of conversation. There was some puzzlement and concern in his eyes.
Grace, I'm working. I'm trying to make sure we have everything we need. You know that I'm always there if you need me. It's just that I have a lot to do right now.
But Grace felt that this excuse could no longer satisfy her. She knew that it wasn't just his busy schedule, but that they had lost something important.
I know that you work and take care of us, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about us, George, that we no longer have the connection that we had before. I feel lonely even when you're around.
George fell silent. He wasn't ready for such a confession. Deep down, he may have realized that their relationship had changed, but he never thought about it out loud. He was used to calmness, to stability, and did not think about the fact that Grace might feel differently. After that night, their conversations became even less frequent. George began to avoid such topics, thinking that over time everything would get better by itself. But Grace spent more and more evenings alone, feeling their marriage gradually fade away. She tried to find something to do that could distract her from thoughts of a failed relationship, but none of them brought relief. Grace tried to diversify their daily lives by offering to spend the weekend together, go to some new place, as they did in their youth. But George almost always refused, citing fatigue or work matters. She saw him gradually closing himself off from her, and it hurt her. One evening, when George was working late again, Grace was sitting in the bedroom looking at their wedding photo on the bedside table. She remembered that day, how happy they were, full of hope for the future. Then it seemed that their love was eternal, that it would withstand any test. But now Grace wasn't so sure. Her soul ached from the realization that her marriage no longer brought her joy. She was increasingly thinking about what deserved more warmth, understanding, emotional intimacy. But she didn't know how to bring it all back into their relationship. It seemed to her that George no longer saw in her the woman he had once fallen in love with. A few months later, when their relationship had not changed, Grace began to notice that she was increasingly distancing herself from George. She continued to fulfill her duties as a wife, but inside she felt increasingly alienated. She couldn't bring herself to feel the closeness they had before again. One evening, when they were having dinner in silence again, Grace decided to have another frank conversation.
George, I can't pretend that everything is okay anymore. It's hard for me. I don't feel like a part of this marriage anymore.
George, tired after work, looked at her anxiously.
What do you want to say, Grace? Do you want to leave?
Grace shook her head, not knowing how to properly express her feelings.
No, I don't want to leave. I want us to change something so that we can get closer again. But I don't know how to do it anymore.
George sighed, feeling the weight of her words. He finally realized that their problems were deeper than he thought. He understood that something had really changed, but it was hard for him to accept it.
I do not know how to fix this, Grace. I always thought that everything was fine with us. Maybe we just need more time.
Grace felt that she had reached a dead end again. She didn't know how to explain to George that time wouldn't solve their problems. She wanted to change. She wanted to feel loved and needed, but her husband couldn't give her that. After this conversation, Grace finally realized that their marriage might not be able to return to its previous state. Her thoughts began to return more and more often to the fact that she deserves more than just living together without an Jim. It was hard for her to accept this, but she couldn't ignore her feelings anymore. She realized that she was on the verge of making an important decision, but she did not yet know what it would be. Grace did not want to destroy her marriage, but she could no longer live in a world where her heart was empty. Her soul demanded changes, and she felt that these changes were just around the corner. When Grace's daughter Erica announced her wedding to Malik, it became a highlight in the life of the whole family. Grace, despite the personal difficulties in her marriage to George, was happy for her daughter. Erica and Malik looked perfect, young, energetic, full of plans for the future. Grace noticed that her own life looked dull and devoid of passion in comparison, but she did not allow herself to complain. All the attention should have been on the wedding, not on her inner feelings. The wedding was great. All the guests were happy, and the young couple was glowing with happiness. Grace tried to enjoy the moment, but all the time she felt a shadow of loneliness. Even in the midst of all these celebrations, her marriage to George was in the background of her thoughts. It was a marriage that had long lost its meaning and depth. The first meeting with Malik was typical for this kind of event, a short exchange of greetings, formal conversations about how the evening went, what plans for the future. Malik looked confident and charismatic, which immediately caught Grace's eye. He was polite, smiling, and always ready to offer help. He seemed to her to be a real gentleman who respected not only his new wife, but also her parents.
Grace, you look amazing today. Erica said that you have wonderful taste, and now I see why.
Grace smiled, feeling a little warmth from the compliment, but didn't think much of it.
Thank you, Malik. I am glad that Erica has found such a caring and kind husband. You're perfect for each other.
With that, their conversation ended, and Grace returned to her seat at the table. She was happy for her daughter, but something inside her was worried. Malik was someone she hadn't seen in her husband George for many years, young, full of energy and life. Grace couldn't help but wonder how different his attitude towards Erica was from what had happened between her and George. Malik's attention to Erica, his care and tenderness reminded Grace of the days when George was the same. A few weeks have passed since the wedding, and the newlyweds have begun their family journey. Malik and Erica often came to visit Grace's parents. George, as usual, was busy with his own affairs and practically did not pay attention to what was happening around him. But Malik always found time to talk to Grace, find out how she was doing, help with something around the house. These were small things, but Grace noticed how pleased she was with his attention. One day, when Erica was busy at work, Malik stopped by Grace's place to help her with the renovation in the living room, which she mentioned earlier. George was at work, as always. It was an ordinary weekday, unremarkable, but for Grace, this moment was a turning point.
Grace, didn't you say you needed help moving furniture? I'm free right now. I can do it if you want.
Oh, Malik, thank you. That would be great. George is busy all the time. I didn't think I could handle it anymore.
Malik began to move the furniture, and Grace watched him gratefully. He was young, strong, and seemed full of energy. It contrasted with the tiredness and indifference she saw in George. Every time Malik helped her, Grace felt needed, which was a long-forgotten feeling for her. After all the work was done, Malik offered to drink tea. They sat down in the kitchen, and the conversation, which began as an ordinary exchange of pleasantries, suddenly turned into something deeper.
You know, Grace, I've always admired the way you handle everything. Erica said that you are a strong woman, and I can see it for myself.
Grace blushed at his words. It had been nice to hear such compliments for a long time, especially from someone who was so young and full of life.
Thank you, Malik. But to be honest, lately I feel like I'm losing that power.
He looked at her in surprise, trying to figure out what she meant.
What do you mean? You seem so confident to me.
Grace sighed, feeling her long hidden emotions coming to the surface.
It's just that everything changes with age. George and me, we became like neighbors, not like husband and wife. I know he cares about me, but our relationship hasn't been the same for a long time.
Malik listened attentively without interrupting her. His gaze was full of sympathy.
I understand how hard it is, but I think you deserve more, Grace. You should feel loved and needed.
Those words struck a chord with her. Grace hadn't expected such frankness from Malik, but his words resonated with her own thoughts. She didn't know how to react, but suddenly she felt something inside her start to come alive. He was saying what she was afraid to admit herself, that she deserved more than just to exist within the framework of her usual life. After this conversation, their meetings began to occur more often. Malik still came to help with the small chores around the house, but now there was more between them. They talked for hours, discussing life, feelings, dreams. Grace began to notice that every time Malik left, she looked forward to the next meeting with impatience. She began to feel an affection for him that she hadn't felt for George in a long time. It's been a few months since Grace and Malik started spending more time together. He became for her not just a son-in-law, but someone who understood her on a deeper level. She couldn't help but think how different he was from George. With Malik, she felt alive, needed, and interesting again. He was the one she had been looking for a long time, the one who reminded her again that she was a woman, not just a housewife and a mother. But Grace couldn't ignore the guilt that was beginning to creep into her thoughts. She understood that her feelings for Malik went beyond what was allowed, that she was cheating not only on George, but also betraying her daughter. But every day her attraction to him grew stronger. She tried to fight with herself, but her heart pulled her towards him. One day, when they were alone again, Grace couldn't stand it.
Malik, I can't pretend there's nothing between us anymore. I feel like this is wrong, but I can't stop.
Malik looked at her with a serious expression on his face. He knew that this moment would come, but he couldn't hide his feelings anymore either.
Grace, I feel the same way. I've tried to fight it, but I can't deny what's going on. You've become more important to me than I could have imagined.
They both realized that their bond had become more than just friendship or sympathy. It was a real emotional and physical vector that they could no longer ignore. After their conversations began to become more and more open, Grace began to notice that her attitude towards Malika had changed. Previously, he was just her son-in-law, the young husband of her daughter, but now she saw something more in him. Their conversations went beyond formal discussions, and Grace began to discover a man who was full of vitality, attentiveness and caring qualities that she had not felt in her relationship with George for a long time. Every time Malik came to help around the house or just drop in for tea, their conversations started to get deeper. Grace felt that she could be sincere around him, that she didn't have to hide her emotions or worries. He listened to her with the kind of attention she hadn't received from her husband in a long time. Malik, in turn, also shared his feelings and thoughts with her. One day, after a long day, when George was late at work again, Malik came to help fix the lock on the door. Grace invited him to stay for dinner, as Erica was also busy and couldn't come. This evening was a turning point in their relationship.
Malik, I do not know how we would have coped without your help. You always come to the rescue when George is busy.
Malik smiled as he pushed his plate away after dinner.
It's not a problem for me. You and George are family, and I'm always happy to help. And to be honest, I like coming here. It's kind of cozy here.
Grace felt the warmth of his words. She couldn't help but notice that Malik was more attentive to her words and mood than her own husband. He was always ready to support her, give her advice, or just listen to her.
Sometimes I think you shouldn't waste your time helping us so much. You have your own life, youth. but thanks anyway.
Don't say that, Grace. I really like being around. You're an amazing woman. You know how to listen and always find the right words. You're easy.
These words touched her more deeply than she expected. She hadn't heard such compliments in a long time. The young man who was sitting opposite admired her, and it made her feel alive. She noticed how his eyes glittered when he spoke to her. It was more than just politeness, there was something sincere, elusive in his gaze. Gradually, the conversation turned to personal topics. Malik began to tell Grace about his life before marrying Erica, about how he sometimes feels lonely in his relationship. Despite their love for Erica, they also had difficulties. Malik felt that his young wife was too immersed in her career and did not always notice his needs.
You know, sometimes I feel like I don't get enough attention. Erica is so busy with her career. Don't get me wrong, I'm proud of her, but sometimes I feel like I'm not in the first place.
Grace understood his feeling. She had experienced something similar with her husband. A response to his words appeared in her soul, and they began to speak more openly.
I understand you. George was also very focused on his work and business. It seems to me that he and I seem to live in parallel worlds, and our paths almost do not intersect. We stopped being a team a long time ago.
Malik nodded, listening intently. He saw the sadness in Grace's eyes and wanted to comfort her. He understood that her words were riddled with the pain of loneliness and the loss of those feelings that had once been in her life. They continued to talk about their shared experiences, and at that moment a real emotional connection arose between them. Each understood that the other was experiencing similar feelings. After that evening, their relationship began to develop even more rapidly. Malik increasingly found reasons to stop by Grace's place, even if it was simple little things, to help fix something in the house or bring groceries. He always found time to stay longer, and each time their conversations became more personal. Grace began to realize that her attraction to Malika was getting stronger. Malik began to realize that he was pleased to be with Grace, not only because of her wisdom and support, but also because she made him feel needed. In her company, he felt a calmness that he rarely experienced even with Erica. Grace felt young and alive next to him. Every time Malik looked at her or touched her hand by accident, she found herself thinking that feelings were awakening inside her that she had not experienced for a long time. It was unusual and exciting. She knew it was wrong, that she shouldn't feel that way about her son-in-law, but her heart told her otherwise. One day, when they were sitting in the backyard watching the sunset, Grace couldn't stand it and confessed what she had been feeling for a long time.
Malik, I can't keep quiet anymore. It seems to me that something is going on between us, and I do not know how to feel about it.
Malik looked at her with a serious expression on his face. He felt the same way, but he didn't know how to express his thoughts correctly.
Grace, I feel it too. I've tried to ignore it, but I can't. You are more to me than just Erica's mom.
These words hung in the air. Both were aware that they had crossed the border, but neither of them wanted to back down. Their attraction to each other had become too strong to ignore. Grace knew their relationship couldn't go on like this, but she couldn't stop. In the following days, they continued to communicate, but now there was tension in their relationship. Both understood that they were pulling each other into the forbidden. Every time they met, their communication became more intimate and emotionally intense. Grace couldn't deny that Malik had become an important part of her life. He was the one who gave her back her sense of need and importance. One day, when they were alone in the house again, Grace realized that she could no longer hide her feelings. It was hard for her to live with this internal struggle. She couldn't pretend anymore that her attraction to Malika was just a passing infatuation. It was more than that. It was something she had been missing for many years: emotional intimacy and sincere attention. Malik, for his part, could no longer ignore his feelings for Grace. She became for him not just the mother of his wife, but a woman who understood him and with whom he could be himself. He appreciated her wisdom, kindness, and the warmth she radiated.
Grace, I know it's difficult, but I can't hide my feelings anymore. You've become an important part of my life, and I don't want to lose that.
Grace looked at him, feeling her heart constrict with fear and joy at the same time. She knew their relationship was wrong, but her attraction to Malika was too strong to ignore. She couldn't bring herself to push him away, even though she knew she had to.
Malik, I can't pretend anymore either. But what are we going to do? This is not right. We have to stop before we go too far.
Malik nodded, understanding her doubts, but was not ready to back down. He came closer, their eyes met, and at that moment everything was said between them without words. Grace and Malik, continuing their frequent meetings, gradually began to realize that their communication had crossed the boundaries of what was acceptable. The tone of their conversations became more and more intimate, and the emotional intimacy intensified. There was something going on between them that both of them couldn't ignore: passion and attraction. They were aware that these feelings were misdirected, that they were both violating moral and family boundaries, but their bond was getting stronger every day. Every time Malik came to the house where Grace lived, there was tension between them, which both tried to hide. They tried to continue their conversations as before, staying within the framework of formal communication, but it became increasingly difficult for them. Their gazes met more often than before, and every time their hands accidentally touched each other, they felt a flash of emotion that was hard to ignore. Grace, despite her realization that this was wrong, couldn't stop thinking about Malik. He became a source of joy and comfort for her, which she had not received for many years. For Grace, Malik was the one who gave her a sense of vitality that had long since faded in her marriage to George. She had long since come to terms with the fact that her family life had become a routine in which there was no place for passion and sincerity. Malik was the exact opposite of George. He was young, full of energy and sincere interest in her life. He looked at her with respect and attention, which Grace had not felt from her husband for a long time. It made her feel needed and important again. For Malik, Grace was not just his wife's mother, but a woman who understood him on a deep emotional level. He saw her as a wise, strong person, able to listen and support, which contrasted with the relationship he had with Erica. There was a cold distance in their marriage, as Erica was completely absorbed in her career, and she had almost no time for a relationship. Malik felt that his emotions and feelings remained unanswered, but next to Grace he found understanding and warmth, which he missed so much. One day everything changed. One day, when George was at work and Erica was late with another business meeting, Malik came back to Grace to help with chores. But this time it was different. Their communication, which always started with simple conversations about life, quickly turned to more personal topics. Grace noticed how strongly she was attracted to Malika, and her fears that they might cross the border began to recede before the growing attraction. When Malik and Grace met eyes at that moment, they both realized that their bond could no longer remain within the framework of an ordinary friendship. Everything that they had been holding back inside themselves for the past months suddenly spilled out. Their physical attraction, which they had suppressed for so long, became impossible to control. The moment they got close to each other, all moral constraints collapsed. It was the point of no return. Their first intimacy happened unexpectedly and became not only a physical but also an emotional release for both of them. It was a moment when they both allowed themselves to forget about reality, forget about what they were doing, and just follow their feelings. Grace felt alive at that moment, full of emotions she hadn't felt in a long time. It was something she had been missing for many years in her marriage to George. After that moment, their relationship changed. Grace and Malik could no longer pretend that nothing was going on between them. Now it was a real romance, secret, filled with passion and danger. Every time they met, their relationship grew deeper. They were looking for ways to spend time together, hiding their feelings from others. Their meetings became more and more frequent, but each of them was surrounded by the fear of exposure. Grace knew that what she was doing would betray not only her husband, but also her daughter. But she couldn't give up on Malik. He had become too important to her. His presence in her life had become irreplaceable. She couldn't imagine being alone again, returning to the routine of her marriage, in which there was neither passion nor sincerity. Malik was for her the one who gave her a new meaning in life, the one who made her feel like a woman again. Malik, despite his feelings of guilt towards Erica, also could not end this relationship. He knew he was betraying his wife, but his feelings for Grace were too strong. She became for him the person next to whom he could be himself, the one who understood him best. Their meetings became not just a way to escape from reality, but a way to find yourself. They both understood that their affair could not last forever, that sooner or later they would be discovered. But every time they met, their attraction became stronger than the fear of exposure. The mystery of their relationship added a special poignancy to their every moment together. They enjoyed every moment, knowing that it could end at any second. Grace and Malik tried to meet in secret. They chose moments when George and Erica were busy to spend a few hours together. Sometimes it was meetings at her house when George was at work. Sometimes they went out of town to spend time away from everyone. These meetings were full of passion, but also pain, because each time they realized that sooner or later their relationship would become known. Every time they returned to their normal lives, they had to hide their true feelings. Grace continued to live with George, fulfilling her duties, but her thoughts were only about Malik. It was getting harder and harder for her to pretend that everything was okay. Her soul was in chaos. She knew she was destroying her family, but she couldn't give up on Malik. She knew that this relationship couldn't last forever, but she couldn't bring herself to end it. Malik also lived in a state of constant stress. He had to hide his feelings for Grace while continuing to build the appearance of a normal relationship with Erica. But his soul was divided into two parts. On the one hand, he loved Erica, but on the other hand, he was attracted to Grace. It was becoming more and more difficult for him to hide his feelings, and every day the fear of exposure grew. They both knew that their romance had already gone too far, and that the consequences would be inevitable. But every time they met, everything else stopped mattering. They enjoyed the moments they spent together, despite the realization that at some point they would have to face reality. Their attraction grew stronger every day. Grace and Malik couldn't ignore their feelings anymore. Their secret affair had become an integral part of their lives, and they didn't know how to stop this process. They continued to meet in secret, hiding their relationship from everyone, but they understood that it could not last forever. At some point, Grace began to wonder what would happen next. Her guilt was getting stronger. She realized that she was betraying not only George, but also her daughter. But every time she met Malik, she only strengthened her attraction to him. She couldn't stop, even if she knew it would lead to devastating consequences. Malik also felt on edge. He knew he was destroying his family, but his feelings for Grace were too strong to ignore. He could no longer continue to live in constant deception. But he did not know how to end this relationship. Every time they met, he felt that this might be their last meeting, but he couldn't give it up. They both lived in a state of constant stress and fear of exposure, but that didn't stop them. Their romance continued despite all the internal conflicts and the realization that sooner or later their secret would be revealed. Over time, as the relationship between Grace and Malik deepened, Grace became more and more consumed by guilt. She became increasingly aware of the seriousness of what had happened between her and her daughter's husband. Every time she was alone in the silence of her house, thoughts of the consequences of her actions returned to her. The weight of this mystery was becoming more and more unbearable. At first glance, her affair with Malik seemed to be something that gave her the joy she had lost in her routine life with George. But now the joy was increasingly replaced by feelings of guilt and fear. Grace tried to keep her outward calm, but her thoughts kept returning to Malik and their relationship. She couldn't deny that her attraction to him was too strong to just end everything. With each meeting, her heart was beating faster and her feelings were becoming more confused. It had been a long time since she had felt such passion as with Malik, but she understood that this fire was devouring her from the inside. She realized that she had betrayed not only George, who had always been her mainstay, but also her daughter Erica. Every time Erica came to visit or called, Grace felt her heart tighten. Conversations with my daughter, which used to bring joy, have now become a source of pain. It seemed to her that Erica could guess her secret just by looking at her. Deep down, Grace knew that one day she would have to tell the truth, but she was afraid of this moment. Erica has always been her pride, her daughter, to whom she wanted to convey the best in life. Now Grace has betrayed her in the most terrible way, violating the boundaries of the family. Malik, in turn, was also under pressure. It was hard for him to hide his feelings for Grace, because with each meeting he realized that his emotions were not fleeting. He became genuinely attached to her, but his love for Erica haunted him. He loved his wife despite the difficulties in the relationship and did not want to destroy his marriage. However, the attraction to Grace was too strong to just stop seeing her. Every time they were alone, Malik forgot about everything. But upon returning home, he had to face reality. Every encounter with Grace became a source of both pleasure and suffering. In those moments when they were together, Malik felt like he was living life to the fullest. He could be himself next to Grace, talking about his feelings, fears and desires. She understood him like no one else. But every time after the meeting, he had to return home to Erica, keeping the mask of ordinary life on his face. He began to feel like he was being torn apart. On the one hand, he didn't want to betray Erica. On the other hand, he couldn't give up on Grace. Over time, the fear of exposure began to engulf Malik as well. He understood that their secret romance could not last forever. The more they dated, the more the threat of someone finding out about their relationship grew. Malik began to notice the smallest details that could betray their connection. He was afraid of casual encounters, suspicious glances and conversations in which someone might notice their excessive closeness. This fear became his constant companion. Grace also began to fear that someone around her might notice her changes. Her inner state influenced her behavior. She tried to hide her anxiety, but every time George or Erica paid attention to her, she was overcome with fear. It seemed to her that they could feel her guilt, that her every word, every look betrayed her secret. Grace could no longer live in peace in her house. She felt trapped by her own actions. Relations with George became increasingly strained. Grace could spend less and less time with him without feeling a nagging sense of guilt. She saw how he was getting older, how his arms were getting weaker, how his face was wrinkled. She knew that George had always been faithful to her, and this made her guilt even more severe. But despite this, her attraction to Malika was stronger. She tried to maintain the semblance of a normal life, but a hurricane of emotions raged inside her that could not be controlled. Malik also felt that his life was divided into two parts. On the one hand, he continued to be a caring husband and partner for Erica, but on the other hand, his soul belonged to Grace. Each meeting with her brought joy and satisfaction, but after that followed a long streak of regret and fear. It was becoming increasingly difficult for him to remain calm around Erica. He knew that he couldn't hide his feelings indefinitely. Malik began to fear not only for his future with Erica, but also for the whole family. He knew that if their affair was discovered, it would destroy not only his marriage, but also the entire family structure. They both understood that their relationship was on the verge. Each of their meetings was imbued with a sense of danger. Grace and Malik were afraid that someone might see them, that the truth would become known. Their romance turned into a constant tension that threatened to explode at any moment. Grace began to wonder more and more often how long they could continue in the same spirit. She knew that sooner or later everything would become known, and this fear became an integral part of her life. Grace couldn't sleep at night. She tossed and turned in bed next to George, thinking about Malik. Her thoughts raced from memories of recent meetings to fear of the future. She knew she couldn't live with this burden of guilt forever, but it was too hard for her to break up with Malik. Every morning began with a promise to herself to end this affair, but every time she saw Malik, her resolve crumbled. He became a drug for her, which it is impossible to give up. Malik also woke up more and more often at night with a heavy heart. He knew that he was doing the wrong thing, that he was betraying not only his wife, but also the whole family. But his passion for Grace was too strong. He tried to think of ways to end this affair, but each time he was drawn back to Grace. He knew that if their relationship continued, it would lead to disaster, but he couldn't bring himself to leave. With each passing day, their fear of exposure grew stronger. They began to avoid unnecessary glances, meeting in the most secluded places where no one could see them. They knew that the slightest mistake could cost them everything, but even so, they couldn't stop. Their meetings became more intense, but also more passionate. They lived in constant fear of the truth becoming known, but they couldn't give up on each other. At some point, Grace began to feel that her soul could not stand the strain. She cried more and more often alone, thinking about what she had done. She felt like a monster who had betrayed everyone she loved. But despite this, her feelings for Malika were too strong to just stop them. She began to wonder how they could live on if everything was revealed. But every time she thought about it, she was terrified. She was afraid of losing everything: her family, the respect of her loved ones, even her self-esteem. Malik also began to think more and more about what would happen next. He understood that their romance could not last forever, and this scared him. He began to notice that Erica had become more attentive to him, that she was increasingly asking questions about where he had been and what he had been doing. Malik knew she was feeling something, but he still didn't understand what it was. He was afraid of the moment when the truth would come out. This fear became his constant companion. Grace and Malik both knew they were on the edge. Their feelings grew stronger, but their fears grew with them. They both knew that exposure was inevitable, and this turned their meetings into a source of not only passion, but also torment. The revelation of Grace and Malik's affair became inevitable, as they both had anticipated. The secret that they had kept so long and carefully had finally come out. Their relationship, filled with passion, forbidden attraction, and fear of exposure, led to the destruction of many people's lives, and the consequences were devastating. It all started with one random event that put an end to their secret relationship. It was an ordinary day when it would seem nothing foreshadowed trouble. Malik and Grace met once again on one of their secret dates. Their meetings were always held away from the eyes of the family, in secluded places where no one could see them. But this time fate played a cruel joke on them. At some point, someone familiar with the family accidentally noticed them together and did not keep it a secret. Soon, rumors that the mother-in-law and son-in-law were having an affair began to spread among friends and acquaintances. Erica, as expected, found herself at the epicenter of these rumors. She heard talk that her husband and her mother were dating behind her back. Initially, she couldn't believe it. The idea that her own mother would betray her in such a way seemed too absurd. But the more Erica began to notice oddities in the behavior of Malik and Grace, the stronger her suspicions became. Erica, as expected, found herself at the epicenter of these rumors. She heard talk that her husband and her mother were dating behind her back. Initially, she couldn't believe it. The idea that her own mother would betray her in such a way seemed too absurd. But the more Erica began to notice oddities in the behavior of Malik and Grace, the stronger her suspicions became. She began to recall moments that she hadn't previously attached importance to: casual glances, too long communication at family events, secretive conversations that seemed to be filled with something more than just friendships. All these details formed into one picture, which began to take real shape. Erica decided to find out the truth and began to monitor the behavior of Malik and Grace. She became more attentive, looked closely at their interaction, tried to catch Erica decided to find out the truth, and began to monitor the behavior of Malik and Grace. She became more attentive, looked closely at their interaction, tried to catch every hint that her suspicions might be true. And at some point, unable to stand it, she interrogated Malik, demanding an explanation. He tried to get out of it, denied everything, but his lies were too obvious. Erica knew that Malik was hiding something, and her confidence in his betrayal grew every day. Finally, one day, Erica set up an ambush. She saw Malik leaving for another business meeting and followed him. Her heart beat faster with every step until she saw what she was most afraid of. Malik met Grace in a secluded place, and Erica caught them together at the moment when they exchanged a kiss. It was a moment that ruined everything. Erica stood in shock, unable to believe that her own mother and her husband could have gone so far. Everything that happened after that was unbearable for every participant in this drama. Everything that happened after that was unbearable for every participant. Erica, in anger and despair, immediately confronted Malik and Grace, demanding an explanation. She screamed, cried, demanded that they tell the truth. Grace was too depressed to find the words right away. Her heart was bursting with guilt, and she couldn't look into her daughter's eyes. Malik, realizing that there was no point in denying it anymore, just stood in silence, not knowing what to say. Everything that could be hidden was revealed. Erica returned home feeling that her world was falling apart. She realized that her marriage to Malik was ruined, and she could not accept that her mother had betrayed her in this way. Erica immediately told her father, George, everything. It was a real shock to him. He had always trusted Grace and was confident in her loyalty. The news that his wife had cheated on him with their own son-in-law was like a lightning bolt. He couldn't believe what had happened, and like Erica, was in a state of deep shock. The family, which until that moment had seemed unfamily, which until that moment had seemed united and happy, was destroyed overnight. George was furious. He couldn't forgive Grace for her betrayal. He realized that the years they had spent together no longer meant anything. Their marriage, based on trust and support, no longer existed. He demanded that Grace leave their house immediately. To him, she was no longer his wife. Grace, despite all her guilt, tried to explain herself, but George didn't want to hear anything. It was too painful for him, and he could no longer look at her as a life partner. Malik, for his part, also faced the consequences of his actions. His relationship with Erica was ruined forever. She filed for divorce, not wanting to have anything more to do with him. Malik realized that he had lost not only his wife but also his whole life, which they had built together. He had to leave the house, and he was left alone, trying to cope with what he had destroyed. He knew that he had betrayed Erica. He knew that he had destroyed her trust and their life together. He also knew that their marriage could no longer be restored. The revelation of Grace and Malik's affair became the subject of discussion in their social circle. Relatives, friends, and acquaintances condemned their actions. No one could believe that a mother and son-in-law could betray their loved ones in such a way. Grace and Malik have become outcasts in their community. Everyone who knew them turned their backs on them. Their relationship was so forbidden and unacceptable to others that they became the object of ridicule and contempt. Grace has lost not only her family but also the respect of society. She was left alone, isolated from everyone she knew. Her own daughter, Erica, refused to communicate with her. Erica could not forgive her mother for betraying her in the most terrible way. Grace knew that she had ruined not only her marriage, but also her relationship with her daughter, which was most important to her. She tried to find ways to deal with it, but the guilt was too strong. Malik also found himself alone. He had to leave the family he had built with Erica and start a new life. But this new life was full of suffering. He understood that he had destroyed everything he had, and his betrayal had cost him not only his marriage, but also his reputation. He could no longer return to the environment that used to be his home. Grace and Malik, left alone with their feelings and the realization of their mistakes, tried to find a way to move on. They understood that their affair had led to disastrous consequences for everyone. At one point, they even discussed the possibility of continuing their relationship.
Please tell me, are you enjoying the story? If so, tell me, what lessons have you actually learned? I would really love to hear your comments in the comment section down below. And remember, to support this channel, please subscribe, like the video, comment, just say something. Even a word could literally mean a whole lot. So I want you to tell me, what lessons have you learned from this story? Trust me, these are situations that most people actually gone through. I'm sure some of you that are watching this story have actually gone through this situation. So I want to hear from you. I want to hear how you dealt with the situation that you were faced with.
After the revelation of their secret affair, Grace and Malik's lives changed forever. No one expected their relationship to become known, and now they find themselves in the midst of the devastating consequences of their actions. They both knew that they had made an irreparable mistake, and now they had to deal with the consequences. Grace felt an overwhelming sense of guilt. She destroyed her family, betrayed her husband and daughter, and lost the respect of people who were important to her. Her days were spent in agonizing thoughts about how things could have gone so far. It seemed that until recently everything was under control. Their affair was their personal secret, and now her life has fallen apart. Her home was no longer a quiet haven where she felt safe. George left, Erica didn't talk to her, and it seemed to her that she was all alone in this world. Malik was also in a difficult situation. He could no longer live with his wife. Their marriage was ruined, their trust destroyed. Malik suffered from the realization that he had betrayed not only Erica, but also the entire family that trusted him. Every day was filled with a sense of shame and regret. He couldn't find a place for himself, realizing that his actions had led to so much suffering. The first time they met after the exposure, their communication was strained. Grace tried to hold on, even though everything inside her screamed in pain. She couldn't look into Malika's eyes, realizing that their relationship had become a source of pain for everyone around her.
Malik, I do not know how we got to this point. How could we have come this far?
I do not know, Grace. I ask myself this question every day. It was wrong from the beginning, but we couldn't stop.
They stood in front of each other, but the distance between them seemed greater than ever. It was hard to believe that they had ever been close. There was no warmth in their gazes now that there had been before. Now they were united only by common suffering and awareness of the disaster they had caused. Grace began to lose control of her emotions. Tears began to flow down her cheeks. She couldn't contain all the pain inside of her.
I've ruined my family, Malik. George hates me, Erica. She will never be able to forgive me again. I do not know how to continue living.
Malik came closer, trying to comfort her, but his own hands were shaking. He also felt that his whole world had collapsed.
Grace, I've lost everything too. Erica filed for divorce, and I can't blame her. I can't forgive myself for what I did to her and to all of us.
Their conversation trailed off. Both stood in silence, feeling the weight of their mistakes. The tension between them grew, and each meeting became more difficult. They realized that their relationship was destructive, but there was no way they could change the past. Despite this, Grace kept coming back to the idea that she couldn't live with this guilt. She needed to do something to try to correct her mistakes, even though she knew it might not be possible. Every time she tried to talk to Malik, the gap between them grew. They both tried to deal with the pain in their own way, but that their efforts seemed fruitless. Grace often sat in silence, thinking about her life up to this point. She recalled how happy she and George were at the beginning of their marriage, how proud she was of their family. Now it all seemed like a distant dream. She wanted to go back, but she knew there was no turning back. Malik was also going through his own internal crisis. He realized that he had destroyed his family, and now his everyday was full of regrets. He couldn't find a place for himself, didn't know how to become a respected person again. He was torn apart by the pain of having betrayed everyone he loved. Every day their communication became more intense. Malik tried to comfort Grace, but their relationship could not be the same as before. They could no longer hide behind passion and attraction. Now they were united only by guilt and a sense of loss.
I think we need to stop this communication, Grace. Every time we see each other, it only increases our suffering.
Grace knew Malik was right. Their meetings brought no comfort, only a reminder of what they had done.
Yes, you're right. But what's next? How are we going to live on?
Malik was silent. He didn't know what to say. Both realized that their lives would never be the same again. Each of them had to find their own way, but so far they didn't know how to do it. Over time, the tension between them became unbearable. Grace became more and more withdrawn into herself, not knowing how to cope with her inner feelings. She lost her daughter's trust, her husband left, and now she is left alone in an empty house that was once full of love and happiness. All she has left is the bitterness of the mistakes she made. Malik also felt lost. He tried to restore at least some stability in his life, but he realized that he had destroyed everything he had. There was no forgiveness for him, either from his family or from himself. He kept thinking about how things could have gone so far, but no answers came. One day, after a particularly hard day, Grace decided that she needed to meet Malik one last time to put an end to their relationship. She realized that this was the only way to try to start her life anew, despite all the destroyed bridges. When they met, the tension between them was almost palpable. They understood that this was the last meeting, and that their bond could no longer be saved.
Malik, I want us to stop this forever. I can't live with this burden of guilt anymore. We need to let each other go.
Malik nodded, feeling the same pain. He knew Grace was right. Their relationship has caused destruction, and the only way to move on is to let go of the past.
I understand, Grace. I can't keep living like this either. We both deserve a chance to start over, even if it's going to be difficult.
They exchanged the last words, and at that moment both realized that this was the end of their relationship. They said goodbye, realizing that they would never be able to return to what had been between them. After this meeting, Grace and Malik began to move each on their own path, trying to rebuild their lives, but the realization of their mistakes remained with them forever. After the revelation of the affair with Malik, Grace felt that her life was ruined. She lost her family, her daughter, and most importantly, her husband's trust. Left alone in an empty house, Grace couldn't shake the feeling of utter despair. Every day her soul was tormented by thoughts that she would not be able to return what she had destroyed with her own hands. But despite all this, Grace didn't want to give up. She knew she had to try to repair her relationship with George, if only to partially correct her mistakes. It's been a few weeks since George left their house. Grace lived in complete isolation. She no longer talked to her daughter, Erica, as she refused to even talk to her. All her attempts to get in touch ended up being ignored or coldly rebuked. It broke her heart, but Grace understood that Eric could understand. How can you forgive a mother who betrayed her own daughter? But she hoped that perhaps in time the wounds would heal and they would be able to speak again, at least as mother and daughter. However, Grace now understood that her main task was to restore her relationship with George. He was her life partner, the man she had lived with for many years, and although their marriage had long ceased to be the same as in the beginning, Grace still had deep feelings for him. She knew that she had hurt him badly, but she believed that if she honestly confessed her mistakes, he would be able to forgive her. One evening, gathering her thoughts, Grace decided to call George. She stared at the phone screen for a long time, afraid to dial his number, but eventually she did it. The bell rang 3 times before she heard his voice.
Grace.
His voice was cold, as if there was an invisible wall between them. But Grace was already ready for this.
George, please don't hang up. We need to talk.
There was silence, and Grace thought for a moment that he might just hang up. But George didn't do it.
What do you want, Grace?
His voice was full of disappointment and fatigue, and Grace felt her heart clench with pain again. She gathered all her strength and answered,
I know I've made a lot of mistakes. I realize that I betrayed you, and I understand that it will be hard for you to forgive me, but please give me a chance to explain myself.
George was silent for a few seconds before answering.
What's there to explain, Grace? Everything has already happened. You betrayed me and our family.
Those words hit Grace, but she knew she deserved them. She couldn't deny that her actions were terrible, and she knew that it couldn't be fixed with a simple apology.
You're right. I betrayed you. I let us both down. But I'm asking you to at least listen to me. We've been together for so many years, George. It can't just be crossed out.
George sighed heavily. Good, let's meet. But don't expect it to change anything. This answer gave Grace a small spark of hope. He agreed to the meeting, and that was something. Perhaps she still has a chance to restore the relationship a little. The next day, they met at a small cafe that was far from their home. It was a place they rarely visited, so that no one would see them together, because rumors had already spread through their common circle of friends. Grace arrived first and sat fidgeting with her hands. She knew that this was going to be one of the most difficult meetings of her life. When George entered the cafe, she immediately noticed how much he had changed. He looked tired, his face was serious, and there was deep sadness in his eyes. He sat down opposite her, and silence fell between them.
You wanted to talk. I'm listening.
Grace knew she had to be honest. There was no point in hiding anything now or trying to mitigate his mistakes. George, I'd like to start by saying that I'm sorry. I know it's not enough to fix everything, but it's true. I'm really sorry about what happened. I do not know how I could have gone so far. It seemed to me that our relationship had cooled down, and I started looking for something that I hadn't felt for a long time. She paused, hoping that he would say something in response, but George just remained silent, listening to her.
You've always been a pillar of support for me, but over the years we've started to lose each other. I felt like you didn't see me as a woman anymore, that you were distant, and instead of trying to talk to you, I made a terrible mistake.
George looked at her, his face showing nothing but fatigue.
I'm not going to justify you, Grace, but I'm not perfect either. Maybe I've really become less attentive to you, but that doesn't excuse what you've done.
Grace nodded, agreeing with his words. I know. I'm not asking for excuses. I just want you to understand that I still love you despite everything, and I'm asking you for a second chance. I understand that maybe this is too much, but I can't live with this feeling without trying to fix it." George was silent for several minutes, his gaze focused on the table. He seemed to be thinking about what to say. Finally, he spoke.
Grace, I do not know if I will ever be able to forgive you. You ruined everything we had. But I can't deny that we've lived together for many years and we've had good times. I need time to think about it.
Those words were like a ray of light in the dark for Grace. He didn't reject her right away, which already seemed like a step forward. She knew she hadn't won yet, but at least she had a chance.
I understand, George, and I'm ready to give you all the time you need. I just hope that you can understand me and maybe forgive me in time.
George nodded, his face still serious.
I'll let you know when I'm ready for the next conversation, but don't get your hopes up too high yet.
With that, he got up and left, leaving Grace sitting in the cafe with a heavy heart. But despite everything, she felt a little hopeful. This conversation made her realize that everything might not be lost yet, that maybe their family could recover after all this. After this meeting, Grace began to realize that rebuilding a relationship with George would take a lot of time and effort. She realized that just words are not enough. She needs to act. The first step was to work on yourself. Grace realized that despite all the excuses, she had to take responsibility for her actions and their consequences. She started going to a psychologist to sort herself out and understand why she took this step. Every day it became clearer to her that her actions were the result not only of problems in her marriage, but also of her own dissatisfaction with life. Grace understood that her relationship with George was gradually cooling, but instead of working on it, she was just looking for a way out in another person. A few months later, George called Grace and offered to meet again. She agreed with a sinking heart, knowing that this meeting could be decisive. After Malik and Grace's affair was revealed, Malik's life changed dramatically. He was the center of attention, but not in the way he was used to. Instead of the previous respect and sympathy from his friends and colleagues, he faced condemnation and contempt. Many turned away from him, not wanting to have anything to do with the man who betrayed his wife and destroyed his family. Malik understood that his mistakes could not be fixed so easily, and that his life would never be the same again. It all started when his best friends, with whom he had been in contact for many years, suddenly stopped responding to his calls and messages. When Malik tried to meet with them in person to explain the situation and possibly get support, their reaction was not what he expected. One evening, after several days of unsuccessfully trying to reconnect with friends, Malik decided to go to the bar where they usually gathered. He knew that he risked meeting them there and hoped that they would at least listen to him. When he entered the bar, he immediately noticed them sitting at a table in the corner. But as soon as he approached them, their views changed.
Malik, why are you here?
James, his old friend, with whom they had gone through many difficulties, looked at him with a cold expression on his face. They had been inseparable before, but now there was no hint of friendly warmth in his eyes.
I came to talk. You're all ignoring me, and I'd like to explain myself.
There was a pause. The other friends at the table exchanged glances. None of them invited Malik to sit down. He stood in awkward silence, feeling the tension build up.
And what are you going to explain? Everything is already clear. You cheated on Erica with her mother. You don't seem to have anything to explain.
These words struck Malik like lightning. He expected condemnation, but was not prepared for how harsh it would be. He tried to justify himself.
I know I made a terrible mistake, but I'm not trying to justify myself. I just want you to understand that it didn't happen the way everyone thinks it did. Everything got out of control.
James grinned, his gaze filled with contempt.
Out of control. Malik, you crossed a line that no one should have crossed. You betrayed your wife and destroyed your family. Do you think we can just forget about it?
Malik felt the ground slipping away from under his feet. He knew that his action had no excuses, but he still hoped that his friends would at least try to understand him.
I just want to fix everything. I realized that I did the wrong thing, but I don't want to lose you all. You are the only ones I have left.
Malik, you lost us the moment you betrayed Erica. You are no longer the person we knew.
Malik felt a lump rise in his throat. He couldn't believe that his relationship with his friends had collapsed so quickly. A few months ago, they were inseparable, sharing their problems, laughing, going through difficult moments together. And now it's all gone. He wanted to say something in response, but realized that any words would be meaningless. Instead, he just nodded and, without saying a word, turned around and left the bar. Once outside, he felt a wave of despair wash over him. He has lost not only his family, but also friends who have been a part of his life for many years. The days passed in silence and solitude. Malik became more and more withdrawn into himself, realizing that his life would never be the same again. He tried to find solace in his work, but even there it was different. Colleagues who used to communicate with him on equal terms now avoided him. He became an outcast, a man everyone whispered about behind his back, but no one wanted to deal with. Malik tried to focus on his work to take his mind off everything that was going on in his life, but his thoughts kept returning to what he had lost. Every day Malik returned to the empty apartment. He could no longer live with Erica. Their marriage was ruined, and she filed for divorce. They didn't talk much. All his attempts to talk to her ended in cold, short answers. She didn't want to see him and wasn't going to forgive him. One evening, sitting on the couch in the dark, Malik realized that his life was completely ruined. He lost his wife, family, friends, and the respect of society. He knew it was all his fault, but he didn't know how to move on. He couldn't fix his mistake. It was like an irreparable scar on his life. A few weeks later, Malik decided to seek help from a psychologist. He realized that he could no longer cope with his condition on his own. He needed to sort out his feelings and figure out how to move on. In the first session, he felt awkward, not knowing where to start. The psychologist, a woman named Dr. Tracy, was attentive and supportive.
Malik, I understand that it's not easy for you right now. Do you want to tell me what brought you here?
Malik was silent for a moment, trying to collect his thoughts.
I ruined everything. My life. I've lost everything. Family, friends, wife. Everyone turned their backs on me.
Do you feel isolated?
Malik nodded.
Yes, I understand that I am to blame for everything, but it doesn't ease the pain. I do not know how to live on.
Dr. Tracy looked at him sympathetically.
You made a serious mistake, and it changed your life. But the first step is to acknowledge that you are ready to work on yourself. You understand that not everything can be returned, but you can learn to live with it.
Malik sighed. It was hard for him to hear these words, but he knew it was true. He couldn't bring back the past, couldn't fix what had already happened.
I do not know if I will ever be able to forgive myself for what I did.
Dr. Tracy looked at him carefully.
Forgiveness is a difficult process, but it's important to start by understanding why you made this mistake. We can figure this out together, and maybe in time you can find a way to win our peace.
These words gave Malik a little hope. He didn't know if he would ever be able to completely get rid of the guilt, but he knew he had to at least try. Each session with Dr. Tracy helped him realize his actions and sort out his feelings. Over time, Malik began to look for ways to rehabilitate himself in the eyes of society. He realized that just apologizing was not enough and began to participate in community initiatives, helping other people who found themselves in difficult life situations. He realized that he would not be able to regain his former respect, but at least he could try to do something good for others. He joined charities that helped people in difficult circumstances. It became a way for him to regain at least a little self-esteem. He started working with teenagers, helping them cope with life problems and sharing his experiences. Malik hoped that his story could be a warning to someone so that they would not repeat his mistakes. Despite the fact that it made him feel better, Malik still couldn't get rid of the inner emptiness. He realized that his life would never be the same, that he had lost too much to ever return to a normal life. But he continued to struggle, hoping that one day he would find inner peace and forgiveness, both from himself and from others. Every day was a new battle for him, but he learned to live with it. After the betrayal of her mother and husband, Erica found herself in a state of deep inner pain and confusion. What happened destroyed her trust in the people closest to her, and she felt like her world had collapsed. Having experienced such betrayal from the two main figures in her life, her mother and her husband, Erica realized that she could no longer trust anyone, and this feeling permeated her more and more every day. The first weeks after the exposure were full of chaos and anxiety. Erica tried to keep an outward calm, continuing to go to work, performing her daily duties, but a storm of emotions raged inside her. Every time she was alone, her thoughts would return to what had happened. She replayed the moment in her head when she saw Malik and Grace kissing, and over again she couldn't believe that it had actually happened. Erica has always considered her mother to be a role model, a strong, confident woman who lived a long and happy life with her father. She couldn't imagine Grace being capable of such betrayal. Her mother, the same woman who had always taught Erica to be honest and faithful, had broken the most sacred family ties. And Malik, her husband, with whom she shared everything, was the one who betrayed her in the most cruel way. She felt humiliated and trampled on. Every day, Erica became more and more distant from Malik and Grace. It was impossible for her to even think about communicating with them. Every time she saw them, she was overcome with pain and anger that could not be suppressed. She realized that the only way to deal with this was to completely exclude them from her life. Erica moved into another apartment and changed her phone number so that neither Malik nor Grace could contact her. She didn't want to hear their excuses or apologies. It was all too clear to her. They had betrayed her, and now she had to somehow deal with it on her own. One of the ways to get away from the pain was work. Erica plunged into it with her head, trying to fill the void inside herself. She took on more tasks than she could handle and spent more time in the office than ever. Her job became her refuge from reality. Erica became successful, her career began to grow rapidly, and her colleagues admired her efficiency and energy. However, inside she felt that all this was just a way to numb the pain and not solve the real problems. Work helped to distract her, but Erica realized that she needed more than just a distraction. Gradually, she began to realize that her father, George, had also suffered from Grace's betrayal. George, who had always been quiet and calm and had taken care of his family for many years, was just as devastated as she was. Erica did not immediately realize how much this event affected him, since George was not a person who openly expressed his emotions. However, now that his world had been destroyed as well, they both needed each other's support. Erica began spending more time with her father, trying to restore their relationship, which had been strained after George. Although George was a faithful husband and father, after his divorce from Grace, he withdrew into himself, which affected their relationship with Erica. They used to communicate, but their conversations were superficial, and Erica never felt a deep emotional rapprochement with her father. However, now after the betrayal, they both realized that they only had each other left. The first meetings were not easy. George was still withdrawn and avoided talking about what had happened. Erica tried to question him, but he answered in monosyllables, as if afraid to start a long and frank conversation. They often sat in silence until the moment came when Erica went home, feeling disappointed that their communication did not go beyond the phrases of duty. But she didn't give up, knowing that she and George needed to overcome this barrier. Over time, George began to open up gradually. One evening, as they were sitting on the veranda of his house, George suddenly started talking about Grace. Erica froze, listening to his words. He didn't talk about betrayal directly, but his voice was full of pain and disappointment. It was the moment when Erica realized how much George was suffering. It was the first time they had discussed their feelings so openly. George shared that he felt abandoned and betrayed, that he still couldn't believe that his marriage, which seemed so strong, had collapsed because of infidelity. Listening to her father, Erica felt a deep emotional connection with him for the first time in a long time. They both found themselves in the same position, betrayed by those they loved. Now they were not only father and daughter, but also people who shared a common pain. At this point, their relationship began to recover. Since then, Erica and George have been spending more time together. They started meeting every night after work, cooking dinners, watching movies, or just talking. These meetings were a real support for both of them. Erica understood that despite all that had happened, she still had a strong and important relationship with her father. It helped her cope with the feeling of loneliness and betrayal that haunted her every day. George, in turn, was grateful that Erica had not turned her back on him after her divorce from Grace. He began to see her not only as his daughter, but also as a person who helped him cope with pain. He understood that their bond had become much stronger than ever before. George began to share his thoughts and feelings with Erica, which he had never done before. He opened up to her, telling her about his fears and doubts, and this helped them both overcome the crisis. One day, Erica suggested that George go on a trip. It was an unexpected offer, but George agreed. They decided to visit a place where they often visited as a family when Erica was still a child. This place was associated with many fond memories, and for both of them it became a symbol of the restoration of their bond. The trip was surprisingly easy and relaxed. They laughed, recalled the past, and discussed the future. Erica felt that this journey had helped them both regain their lost trust and intimacy. Despite the fact that her relationship with George became a source of comfort for Erica, she understood that her trust problems would not disappear just like that. It was difficult for her to build a new relationship. She was afraid that she would be betrayed again. Every time someone showed interest in her, she immediately remembered Malik and Grace's betrayal. This fear became a barrier that prevented her from moving on. Erica realized that her life had changed forever. But thanks to her father's support, she gradually began to find the strength to move forward. She realized that she could handle it and maybe one day trust people again. But for that, she needed time to heal her mental wounds and restore inner balance. After their affair was exposed and the devastating consequences became apparent, Grace and Malik found themselves in a state of deep emotional and moral crisis. Each of their meetings was now filled not with passion and attraction, but with bitter reflections on what they had done. Their inner feelings of guilt and shame did not leave them, and each of them realized how much they had harmed not only themselves, but also those they loved. Their passion, which once seemed overwhelming, has now turned into a devastating storm, leaving only pain and regret in its wake. Their first meeting after the exposure was especially difficult. Both came to her with different emotions, Grace with a feeling of complete emptiness and a broken heart, and Malik with the weight of guilt and the realization that he betrayed his wife and ruined his life. Their relationship had seemed special to them before, but now it was like a poisonous fruit that they both bit off, and the consequences were much worse than they could have imagined. At this meeting, both of them were silent for a long time, not knowing where to start. All the passion that had once bound them had vanished, leaving only pain. Grace realized that for the sake of her fleeting emotions, she had jeopardized her family, her daughter's trust, as well as her long-term marriage. She felt like a traitor to everyone she loved, especially her daughter Erica, who could no longer look at her without tears and anger. This breakdown of trust between mother and daughter was for Grace the most painful consequence of her affair with Malik. Malik was aware that he had completely destroyed his future with Erica. He saw how she was losing trust in him, how her love for him was disappearing under the yoke of betrayal. He knew that he would never be able to earn her forgiveness again. Malik began to realize that his love for Grace was a mistake that led to him losing everything he had. His feelings for her now seemed empty and meaningless compared to what he had destroyed. With each passing day, the realization that their affair was a mistake became clearer to both of them. In the past, their attraction seemed somehow inevitable, as if they couldn't resist their emotions. But now that the affair was revealed and the consequences became real, they had to face the truth. Their relationship was nothing more than the result of their own weaknesses and emotional dissatisfaction. They realized that they were looking for salvation from their personal problems in each other, but instead only deepened their suffering. Malik began to realize that his interest in Grace was more an attempt to escape from the problems in his own marriage than true love. The attention and care he sought from Grace was what he lacked in his relationship with Erica. But now he realized that these problems needed to be solved with his wife, and not to seek solace on the side. He felt that he had betrayed not only Erica, but also himself by changing his values and moral principles. Grace, in turn, was aware that her feelings for Malik were the result of her own crisis in her marriage to George. She tried to find in the young man what she lacked at home: attention, care, emotional intimacy. But now she understood that her relationship with Malik was an escape from reality, an attempt to fill an inner void. That emptiness remained, but now a sense of guilt for ruined lives has been added to it. They started discussing their feelings and eventually came to the conclusion that their affair was a huge mistake. Each of them felt pain and disappointment, but most importantly, they realized that their relationship had no future. Both of them realized that continuing these meetings was not only pointless, but also wrong. Their romance was not originally built on healthy foundations, and now it has become more than obvious. Malik offered to stop any contact and try to rebuild their lives separately from each other. He knew that their relationship could no longer exist, and even if they tried to continue, it would only lead to further suffering. Grace agreed with him. She also understood that their relationship could not continue, and that each of them had to deal with the consequences on their own. They both decided to separate and not meet again. Malik left to start his life with a clean slate, away from Erica and Grace's family. He understood that his reputation and people's trust had been destroyed, and he needed to rebuild his life. This decision was not easy for him, but he knew that it would be better for everyone. Grace was left alone, realizing that now she would have to face the consequences of her actions and find a way to rebuild her life. She understood that her marriage with George was ruined forever, and her relationship with her daughter could not be restored either. She lost everyone she cared about, and it was a hard blow for her. This story left Grace and Malik with an emptiness in their soul, and with the realization that their decision to be together was nothing more than an illusion that destroyed their lives. Now each of them had to learn to live with the consequences of their actions, cope with guilt, and try to find a new meaning in life without each other. It was a period of self-discovery and reflection for Grace. She had to look at herself from a new angle and realize her mistakes. She began to realize that her affair with Malik was an attempt to avoid solving her own problems, but now she had to face them face to face. Grace realized that she had to find the strength to accept her guilt and move on. Malik, for his part, was trying to start a new life. He understood that he had to restore his reputation and earn the forgiveness of those he had betrayed, but he also realized that it would be a long and difficult process. Now that his affair with Grace was over, he needed to focus on becoming the best version of himself, learning from this painful experience and trying to fix his mistakes. And although their paths have now parted, Grace and Malik both realized one important truth: their romance was a mistake that changed their lives forever. Now they had to deal with the consequences left by this novel and try to find a way to redemption and inner peace, each in their own way. After the devastating end of their relationship, Grace and Malik found themselves on the verge of complete emotional exhaustion. Both realized that their romance, which once seemed so important and all-consuming, left behind only pain and ruined lives. The problems they were now facing were much deeper than they could have imagined at the beginning of their relationship. For each of them, there came a moment when they needed to decide how to move on with their lives and find a way to deal with guilt, disappointment, and loss. Grace, whose life was filled with guilt, decided she couldn't handle it on her own anymore. Every day she felt the weight of her mistakes. The relationship with her daughter Erica remained in a state of complete rupture, and Grace did not know how to regain her trust. Every glance at the photos from family holidays, every corner of their once cozy home reminded her that she had destroyed her family. Her husband George filed for divorce, not wanting to have anything more to do with her, and this was the last blow for her. During the first months after her affair with Malik was exposed, Grace sank into a state of constant depression. She couldn't sleep. She was plagued by nightmares in which she relived the moments of exposure over and over again. With each passing day, her inner pain intensified, and she felt like she was losing control of her life. Even simple activities like cooking or walking down the street became a challenge for her. Grace could no longer see herself in the mirror without feeling deeply ashamed. Her heart broke every time she thought about her daughter, who was now like a stranger to her. One day, sitting in the silence of her empty apartment, Grace realized that she couldn't go on like this. She could not go back and correct her mistakes, but it was no longer possible to live in this state. She needed to do something to start rebuilding her life, otherwise guilt and depression would have consumed her completely. Grace decided to seek help from a professional psychologist to deal with her emotions and find a way to forgiving herself and, perhaps, forgiving those she betrayed. The first sessions with a psychologist were painful for Grace. It was hard for her to open up and talk about her actions. She couldn't talk about her betrayal without crying and feeling deep inner pain. But gradually she began to realize that her mistake was not just the result of passion, but the result of accumulated problems in her marriage and her own emotional dissatisfaction. Her psychologist helped her see that although her actions were destructive, she shouldn't get stuck in the past. Grace began to realize that in order to move on, she needed to accept her guilt, but at the same time forgive herself for what she had done. One of the most difficult aspects of her recovery was the realization that forgiveness would not come immediately. She couldn't just decide that she was forgiving herself and go on living as if nothing had happened. She needed time to go through all the stages of grief, from denial to acceptance. Her psychologist suggested that she practice self-compassion techniques such as meditation, visualization, and keeping a diary to help deal with negative emotions. Grace realized that the healing process would be long, but she was willing to go through it to get her life back. In parallel with this process, Grace began to make attempts to establish a relationship with her daughter. She wrote Erica a long letter in which she openly talked about her feelings, her remorse, and her desire to restore at least part of their relationship. Grace didn't expect instant forgiveness, but she hoped that her honesty and openness would help Erica understand what she was going through. There was no immediate response, and Grace knew it would take time. But the letter itself was an important step towards healing for her, as she was able to express her pain and remorse. Malik, like Grace, was trying to find a way to rebuild his life after a devastating affair. He had lost everything: his marriage to Erica, the trust of his friends, and self-respect. Every day for him became a struggle with feelings of guilt and uselessness. Malik understood that he had betrayed the woman who believed in him and ruined all the plans and dreams that he and Erica had built together. He also knew that he was unlikely to ever be able to regain her trust or earn her forgiveness. After the breakup, Malik felt lost. His old life, which seemed so stable and fulfilling, collapsed in one moment. He could no longer count on the support of his friends and colleagues, who also turned away from him after learning about his betrayal. He was alone and deep in thought about how he could have made such a mistake. Malik was aware that the affair with Grace was an attempt to avoid the problems that existed in his marriage with Erica. But now he realized that this flight only made the situation worse. At some point, Malik decided that he needed to move on, leaving the past behind. He couldn't bring back what he had destroyed, but he could try to build a new life. Malik started looking for a job in another city, away from his past surroundings, to start over with a clean slate. The move became for him a symbol of a new beginning, a chance to rebuild his life, get rid of a heavy sense of guilt, and find inner peace. Malik also began attending therapy to sort out his feelings and try to forgive himself for his mistakes. The healing process for Malik was also long and painful. He knew that he would never be able to completely get rid of the consequences of his actions, but gradually he began to find ways to deal with the guilt. He devoted his time to work and self-development, trying not to repeat the mistakes that led him to destroy his own life. Malik understood that forgiveness would not come instantly, but every day he began to feel that his life could take on a new meaning. Grace and Malik were no longer in touch. Each of them was focused on their own path to recovery, and they understood that their further communication would only complicate this process. They decided to separate forever, leaving their mistakes in the past and trying to build a future apart from each other. Despite the pain and suffering they both went through, this period of their lives became a time of deep self-discovery for them. Grace began to see that her happiness did not depend on a relationship with someone else, but was based on her own ability to cope with difficulties and forgive herself for mistakes. She also realized that her marriage to George had long been problematic, and their breakup was inevitable. The affair with Malik only accelerated this process. Malik, in turn, has learned to accept his weaknesses and mistakes. He realized that trying to avoid problems by fleeing into other relationships was a mistake, and began to work on becoming a more responsible and mature person. He sought to regain his self-respect and start a new life based on honesty and sincerity, both towards others and himself. Forgiveness became an important part of their healing for both of them, but each realized that forgiveness is not just a decision, but a process that requires time and patience. Grace gradually began to find peace within herself, realizing that she could not change her past, but could control how she would live in the future. She began to build new connections, open up to the world and the people around her, trying to restore her self-esteem. Malik also found the strength to move on with his life. His new job and new environment had become a source of renewal and growth for him. He began to appreciate sincere relationships that are built on trust and respect, and tried not to repeat the mistakes that led to his downfall. A few years after these events, Grace and Malik became different people. They have learned to live with the consequences of their mistakes, but they have also learned to forgive themselves. This experience, although it left deep scars, helped them both realize that they could recover and start their lives anew. Now they could both look to the future with confidence, knowing that each of them had gone through difficult trials and came out of them stronger and wiser.
If you made it to the end of part 2 of this thrilling story, then all I can say is congratulations and thank you. These videos really take a lot of time to make, but you guys' support really keep me going. Comments below and share this video with your friends and family. Also, like and subscribe to the channel so that you'll be the first to be notified when I drop a new video.
After Grace and Malik's secret affair became known, their life, once hidden behind a mask of illusions, fell apart before our eyes. The moment the truth came out, the consequences of their actions became irreversible. Each of them had lost more than they could have imagined, and now they both had to learn to live in a world that they had destroyed themselves. Grace, being a woman accustomed to stability and respect in her family and society, felt her world crack at the seams. She lost the trust of her husband, George, who left home when he found out about her infidelity. Their daughter, Erica, was heartbroken and could no longer communicate with her mother, considering her a traitor. Grace felt isolated, being in a house that had once been full of joy and love. The silence of this house now began to weigh on her like a heavy weight. Every corner reminded her of what she had lost, and the mirrors reflected the insecurity and shame that were growing in her soul. Malik, on the other hand, was also on edge. His life with Erica, their plans for the future, everything was destroyed in an instant. Erica filed for divorce, and Malik found himself alone, living in an empty apartment that was no longer filled with her presence. He realized that he had betrayed his wife, the one who believed in him the most, and now he had to live with this burden every day. Malik, being a man accustomed to confidence and stability, now could not find support. It seemed to him that his future was irretrievably lost, and guilt consumed him every day. Their meeting after the exposure was not a relief for either of them. Both found themselves in the grip of disappointment and regret.
Malik, I do not know how we got to this point. I just don't understand how everything could collapse so quickly. We were just trying to feel something real, weren't we?
Grace stood in front of him, her voice brittle, almost brittle, as if she was struggling with inner demons, realizing that she couldn't change what had already happened. She couldn't look at Malik with the warmth she had once seen him with. Now they were connected only by a sense of common defeat and pain.
I ask myself the same question every day. It was wrong from the beginning, and we both knew it. But why didn't we stop? Why did you let it go so far?
His voice was full of bitterness, and there was a sense of fatigue in it. He tried to find answers, but each time he returned to the same thing, they both became hostages of their emotions and weaknesses. Grace felt tears welling up in her eyes again. She tried to suppress them, but the pain was too much. Their bond, which had once seemed so strong and even exciting to them, was now only a source of torment.
I've ruined my life, Malik. George hates me. Erica doesn't even want to talk to me. I've lost everything that mattered.
She covered her face with her hands, tears rolling down her cheeks. These were not only tears of disappointment, but also the realization that there is no way back. Malik came closer. He wanted to comfort her, but his own hands were shaking. He understood that he had also destroyed everything he had.
I lost Erica. She left me, and I can't blame her. I ask myself every day, how could I do this to her? But now it's too late to change anything. We both ruined our lives.
There was a heavy silence in the air. They no longer knew what to say to each other. Their words seemed empty, as did their feelings. The romance that had once seemed real and strong to them was now hidden under mountains of guilt and regret. Every day their communication became more strained. They met to discuss the consequences of their actions, but each time this communication turned into an exchange of accusations and self-accusations.
What now, Malik? What should we do? I can't keep living with this guilt. We have to fix this somehow.
Her voice was full of despair, as if she was still hoping for an opportunity to fix something that was already irreparable. But her gaze at Malik was full of pain.
I do not know how to fix this, Grace. We made a mistake that cannot be fixed. We have lost those we loved. Maybe the best thing we can do now is just stop communicating.
His words sounded like a sentence. They both understood that their affair had not only ruined their own lives, but also the lives of those who were dear to them. Now they were bound only by a common guilt. Grace nodded, knowing he was right. Their connection, which once seemed significant, became a poison that poisoned everything they had. Her heart was broken, but she couldn't continue this cycle of suffering. She wanted to break out of this circle, but she didn't know how. With each passing day, the tension between them increased. They tried to avoid each other, but the realization of their mistake haunted them constantly. Grace, being more emotionally open, suffered more from this breakup. She could not forget what she had done, and every day seemed to her an endless torment. Malik, on the other hand, was trying to deal with his condition somehow. He began to work more, trying to forget about mistakes, plunging into a routine. But every evening, when he returned to the empty apartment, he felt the same pain and regret as Grace. Their affair had destroyed everything he had, and now he had to find a way to survive in a new world full of disappointments and losses. It had been several months since the exposure, and both were still unable to fully recover. Grace began to avoid any contact with Malik, realizing that their communication only increases her suffering. She couldn't look at him without pain, realizing that both of them had caused so much pain to other people. One day Grace decided that they needed to meet one last time to finally put an end to their relationship. They met in the park where it all started. It was a quiet, secluded place where no one could see their conversation. Both came here with heavy hearts, knowing that this would be their last conversation.
Malik, I came here to end this forever. We can't communicate anymore. It only brings us pain.
She spoke calmly, but there was an inner tension in her voice. Grace understood that their relationship could no longer be saved, and that they both needed to move on.
I understand, Grace. We have to stop this. This is wrong, and we both know it. We've ruined too many lives.
His words were full of bitterness, but he also realized that it was pointless to continue this path. Their relationship became toxic, and each of them felt that this was the end. They exchanged the last words, and that was the end of their relationship. Grace left, feeling that now she was alone, and she would have to live with the consequences of her actions. Malik also understood that their affair had left deep scars that would never heal. From that moment on, each of them began their journey to healing. Grace, realizing the depth of her mistake, tried to restore at least part of her life, but realized that it was impossible to bring back the past. She needed to start over, even though she didn't know how to do it. Malik, feeling destroyed, was also looking for ways to fix his life. He understood that he had a long road to recovery ahead of him, and that path would be full of pain and regrets. Life, after exposure, was a hard lesson for both of them. They realized that their actions had consequences that they would have to live with for the rest of their lives. After the revelation of the affair with Malik, Grace's life plunged into chaos. Her world, which once seemed so stable and predictable, collapsed overnight. Every day reminded her of what she had lost: family, love, respect and trust. Now her house, once a symbol of peace and security, had become a place where silence echoed inside her, reminding her of the betrayal she had committed. Grace had been feeling heavy since morning. She could barely get out of bed, as each new day brought nothing but pain and disappointment in herself. Every detail in the house reminded her of the happy moments when she, George, and Erica were together. The photographs on the walls, the old tea set they took out for family holidays, all this was now a symbol of a ruined past that she would never be able to return. One morning, sitting in the kitchen with a cup of coffee, Grace suddenly realized that she couldn't remember the last time she had talked to Erica. The daughter, upon learning about the betrayal, stopped any communication with her. Erica didn't even want to look in her direction, completely severing the contact. Grace knew it wasn't temporary. She understood that by her act she had betrayed not only George, but also her daughter, whose trust she would never be able to restore. Grace's inner world became a battlefield where guilt and despair fought. She knew what she had done, and she knew that what she had done could not be undone. But the guilt was becoming unbearable. Every time she tried to think about the future, her mind kept coming back to the same question: why did I do this? She was sitting in an empty living room, her gaze wandering around the room, filled with memories of happy times. Everything that had once been associated with joy now seemed alien and dead. Silence became her constant companion.
Why didn't I stop? Why did I let this go so far?
She was saying to herself, as if trying to find some excuse for her actions. Every morning was a repetition of the same thing for her. Grace got out of bed, walked around the house, looked at things that no longer brought her comfort, and immersed herself in thinking about what she had destroyed. Her life was now filled with loneliness. George left, and Erica no longer answered her calls and texts. Even the friends who had supported her before now avoided meetings and conversations. One day Grace decided to write a letter to Erica. She sat for a long time in front of an empty sheet, not knowing where to start. Her hands were shaking and her thoughts were confused. She wanted to explain herself, but she knew that no words could justify her action.
Dear Erica, I know that I no longer deserve your trust. I betrayed you and destroyed our family. I'm not looking for forgiveness, because I understand that it may not be. But I want you to know that I'm truly sorry. I love you and I will always love you. Even if we never see each other again. I just hope that one day you can at least listen to me.
She froze, realizing that her attempts to establish contact with her daughter might not make any sense, but she couldn't just sit back. Her heart was breaking at the thought that Erica would never look at her the way she used to. In the evening, Grace tried to call George again. She needed to hear his voice, at least for a moment. But, like all the previous times, he did not answer. Her messages went unread, and her calls went unanswered. George was gone, and now it seemed that everything that connected them had disappeared forever. One day, her friend Linda came to her, the only one who did not completely turn away from her. Linda, although disappointed by Grace's action, tried to support her, realizing that she was going through a difficult time. Linda, Grace, you can't go on like this. I understand that it's hard for you, but you have to move on with your life. You can't bring back the past, but you can still fix at least part of your life.
How? How can I fix something? I've ruined everything, Linda. George is gone, Erica hates me. How do I move on when everything that mattered is gone?
Her voice was full of despair. Linda knew that words wouldn't help much in such a situation, but she couldn't just stand by.
Grace, you have to start with yourself. You can't bring George back or immediately reconnect with Erica, but you can try to forgive yourself.
Forgive yourself? I don't even know how to do it. I can't forgive myself. Every time I look at my life, I only see mistakes.
Linda sighed and put her hand on Grace's shoulder.
It's a long way, Grace, but you have to start it. Accept what cannot be changed and try to move on. Time does not heal, but it helps to understand that life goes on.
After Linda left, Grace sat alone for a long time, thinking about her words. Forgive yourself, this thought seemed alien to her. How can you forgive yourself for ruining the lives of those you love? How can you find the strength to do this? It's been a few weeks. Grace continued to feel lost. She tried to restore her usual routine, but each time she was faced with the fact that the world around her had changed forever. People who used to respect and love her now avoided her. She had lost her place in society, and now her life had become a series of days filled with despair and regrets. She knew it couldn't go on like this, but she couldn't find the strength to change anything. One day she decided to consult a psychologist, hoping that professional help could help her cope with feelings of guilt and loss. Grace couldn't speak for a long time during the first session. She was sitting in front of the psychologist, nervously fiddling with a handkerchief and looking at the floor. Her inner feelings were so strong that words seemed meaningless to her.
Grace, take your time. I'm here to listen to you. When you're ready, tell me what's bothering you.
Grace took a deep breath and, gathering all her strength, began to speak.
I've ruined everything. I cheated on my husband, betrayed my daughter, and now I do not know how to live on. I just can't forgive myself.
Her voice was trembling. She could barely control herself.
This is a great recognition, Grace. Admitting your mistakes is the first step on the path to healing. But forgiving yourself is a long process. Are you ready for this?
I don't know. I want to change my life, but I don't know how to do it.
The psychologist nodded, showing patience and understanding.
Let's start small. Take a step every day to let go of your past mistakes. It won't be easy, but in time you will be able to find peace. Let's start with a simple one. What could you do for yourself today to feel a little better?
Grace didn't know how to answer that question. She was used to living with constant guilt, and the idea that she could afford to feel even a little relief seemed strange to her.
I don't know. Maybe take a walk in the park? I haven't done this in a long time.
This is a great first step. Start small, and gradually you will see how it helps you move forward.
After the session, Grace actually went to the park. Walking through the quiet alleys, she felt a little lighter, although the pain and guilt still remained. But something has changed. Her steps seemed more confident, and she realized that maybe Linda and the psychologist were right. The healing process is long, but it is possible. Grace knew that it would be difficult, if not impossible, to restore relations with George and Erica. But now she realized that she needed to start with herself, learn to forgive herself for past mistakes in order to move on. Her life will never be the same, but she could find the strength to build a new future, despite the ruined past. After the truth about his affair with Grace surfaced, Malik found himself in a situation he could not have foreseen. In an instant, he lost everything that was dear to him: his wife, friends, the respect of colleagues, and most importantly, the trust of people who once considered him a worthy person. His life, which seemed stable and understandable, collapsed like a house of cards. The feeling of betrayal, not only from those who turned away from him, but also from his own betrayal towards himself, became an unbearable burden that he could not get rid of. Erica, his wife, was the first to leave. As soon as she found out about his infidelity, she packed up and left their shared house. Her eyes, full of pain and disappointment, haunted Malik every time he was alone. She did not make scandals, did not shout or demand explanations. Her silence was the worst punishment for him. She just left, and this departure of hers was proof for Malik that he had lost her trust and love forever. Every day after she left, the emptiness in the house became more noticeable. Their apartment together, once full of life and laughter, has now turned into a silent space filled only with memories of what happened and a sense of inescapable guilt. Every item, their shared photos, her books on the shelves, even her favorite cup, became a reminder of what he had destroyed. Malik walked around the rooms, restless, his thoughts returning to the same thing: how could I let this happen? However, The hardest test for Malik was the realization that his actions not only hurt Erica, but also made him an outcast in the eyes of others. His friends, with whom he had been in contact for many years, no longer wanted to deal with him. One by one, they began to move away. Someone openly declared their disappointment, and someone simply stopped responding to his calls and messages. Malik, who always believed that he would be supported in difficult moments, found himself alone with his problems. He realized that betrayal destroys not only relationships with loved ones, but also the respect that was so difficult to win throughout his life. At work, too, everything has become different. His colleagues, who had always respected him for his professionalism and responsibility, began to look at him with disbelief. It seemed that his every step was now being evaluated through the prism of his personal life. There were no more friendly conversations in the office that he was used to. There was more and more tension, and his presence began to cause awkwardness. Malik felt that he had become an outsider among those with whom he had once worked shoulder to shoulder. Every evening he returned home to an empty apartment, where only silence and loneliness awaited him. He tried to distract himself by immersing himself in work or watching movies, but it didn't bring relief. There was a void inside him that nothing could fill. Malik understood that his life would never be the same again. He began to think that the affair with Grace was not only a mistake, but also an indicator of his own weakness. At the moment when it all started, he felt tired of everyday life, looking for something new that could light a fire in his life. However, instead, he destroyed everything that was really valuable to him. Malik realized that his search for passion and adventure had led to a complete loss of meaning in life. In his attempts to find something new and exciting, he destroyed everything that was really important. At first, he tried to justify himself to himself, to look for explanations for his actions. I was unhappy, my feelings were real. I couldn't do it any other way. But the more he thought about it, the more clearly he realized that these were just excuses. The real reason was that he couldn't cope with himself, with his desires and weaknesses. Malik ruined his life because of his own inability to control his impulses. His internal crisis was growing every day. Malik was plunging into a state of deep depression, feeling that he was losing control of his life. All his usual sources of support, family, friends, work, were no longer available. He tried to return to normal life, but each time he was overtaken by the realization that the old normality no longer exists. Malik could find no solace in anything, and his days became an endless repetition of the same thing: guilt, shame, and despair. Periodically, he thought about leaving, starting over with a clean slate in another city, away from the place where everyone knew about his mistake. But he knew that running away would not solve his problem. He could change his place of residence, but he could not escape from himself, from his thoughts and feelings. Moving would not have relieved him of the burden of knowing that he had betrayed everyone he cared about. One day, Malik decided that he had to somehow try to rebuild at least part of his life. He began to look for ways to drown out his guilt and start over. It seemed to him that if he began to devote more time to work, it would help to distract himself. But here, too, he was going to fail. Work assignments that had previously been a source of satisfaction for him now seemed meaningless to him. He could no longer enjoy what he was doing. Malik realized that his inner world had become empty, and nothing that used to bring joy could save him anymore. He also realized that it would be impossible to restore relations with Erica, even partially. She no longer answered his calls and texts, and he knew that she was gone from his life forever. That thought hurt him the most. Erica was not just a wife for him, she was his best friend, the person with whom he shared all his dreams and plans for the future. The loss of her trust and love left an indelible wound in his heart. Every day Malik became more and more withdrawn into himself. He stopped looking for contacts with others, avoided meetings with colleagues and friends. His social life, once so active and intense, has become completely isolated. He was in a state where every new day seemed unbearably long and meaningless to him. His inner world was destroyed, and Malik did not know how to regain his former confidence and calmness. Malik often thought about how things might have been if he hadn't started this affair with Grace, if he had stopped in time, if he had realized what it would lead to. But each time these thoughts brought him back to the same thing, to the realization that the mistakes he had made could not be corrected. He had lost too much, and now he had to live with it for the rest of his life. One such day, sitting in his empty apartment, Malik realized that he could no longer continue to live like this. He decided to seek help from a psychologist, hoping that this would at least partially help him cope with his inner demons. He knew that he would not be able to return to his old life, but perhaps he could learn to live with the consequences caused by his actions. The first visit to the psychologist was difficult for Malik. It was difficult for him to talk about his feelings and openly admit that he had ruined his life because of weakness. But as the sessions continued, he began to realize that his downfall was not only a consequence of his actions, but also his inability to deal with internal conflicts. Malik began to slowly, step by step, figure out his motives and realize that in order to move on, he needed to take responsibility for his mistakes. The healing process turned out to be long and painful. Malik could no longer get back what he had lost, but he began to look for ways to live with it. Over time, he realized that recovery requires not only time, but also forgiveness, not only from those he betrayed, but also from himself. His life remained lonely and empty, but now he knew that he had to learn to live with it, to cope with inner emptiness and regrets in order to find at least some hope for the future. After months filled with tension, guilt and bitterness, Grace and Malik finally realized that their romance, which once seemed passionate and exciting, has become a destructive force in their lives. Initially, their relationship brought both a sense of novelty, passion, and even some temporary solace from reality, but over time it became clear that their relationship had destroyed everything they had ever valued. Now that the passion had faded, there were only bitter consequences that they both had to deal with. Grace became more and more depressed, and every day she saw more and more clearly that her relationship with Malik had led to the complete collapse of her life. She lost her family, her husband George and daughter Erica, who were the most important things in her life. A marriage that, although it had lost its passion, was still a pillar and stability for Grace. Her role as a mother also disappeared along with her daughter's trust and respect. The guilt of destroying their lives haunted her everywhere. Every day she realized that her relationship with Malik, which began as an attempt to regain lost emotions and intimacy, became a source of only pain and loss. Malik was going through a similar condition. His marriage to Erica was ruined, and now he was forced to live in an empty apartment, feeling lonely and lost. He realized that his affair with Grace was nothing more than an illusion, an attempt to escape from the problems in his own marriage. Their relationship was not built on love or mutual understanding. It was an escape from reality, which eventually turned into a disaster for everyone. Malik also realized that continuing this relationship would only increase his and Grace's suffering. One day they met to talk. They both knew that this conversation was inevitable. Their affair brought them to a point where further continuation of the relationship would be pointless and harmful for each of them. They no longer felt the passion and attraction that had bound them earlier. Instead, the heavy burden of responsibility for destroyed families and lives fell on their shoulders. Their communication became strained, and every time they met, a feeling of inner emptiness grew between them. As they sat at a table in a quiet cafe, their faces were serious and their gazes avoided each other. Both understood that today they had to part forever. Malik, realizing that their romance had long since lost its meaning, took the floor first. He told Grace that the continuation of their relationship would only be a continuation of suffering and suggested that they separate. He felt that their bond would bring them nothing but pain, and that the best thing they could do was let each other go and try to rebuild their lives separately. Grace nodded in silent agreement. She had long understood that their relationship had reached an impasse. When they first started their romance, she thought it would bring her a sense of life, that she had missed so much in her marriage to George. But now all she felt was regret and pain. There was no room for romance in her heart anymore, and she knew that a breakup with Malik was inevitable. Their conversation was short and devoid of emotion. Everything has been said before, both pain and disappointment. Both were aware that they had ruined other people's lives, and had left deep scars. They didn't need to discuss the details anymore. There was no point in accusations or attempts to justify their actions. They were both guilty, and their guilt bound them more than passion had ever bound them. At some point, Grace felt that the conversation was over and got up from the table. She looked at Malik one last time and felt strangely relieved. It was not a farewell to love, but a farewell to the source of suffering. Her feelings for Malika had long since disappeared, and it was now clear to her that their relationship had been a devastating mistake. She wanted to get rid of that past and try to start over, even if she didn't know how to do it. Malik was also ready to leave. He no longer saw any point in continuing to meet with Grace, because every conversation they had only reminded him of his betrayal and mistakes. He wanted to rebuild his life as much as possible, and he understood that this could only be done on his own. Malik felt it was time to move on, even though he still had a long way to go to heal. When they parted, each went his own way without looking back. It was their last goodbye, and they both knew that their relationship would forever be in the past. There was no need to try to understand each other or make excuses anymore. Their romance was over, and now each of them had to find a way to survive in the world they had destroyed themselves. For Grace, it meant the beginning of a long road to self-forgiveness. Her inner world was destroyed, and every day she faced the memories of what she had lost. She couldn't go back to her old life anymore, and now she had to find a way to live with the guilt and try to rebuild her soul. She knew that it would be almost impossible to restore relations with George and Erica, but she also understood that the only way to move on was to accept her mistakes and try to correct their consequences. Malik, having broken off his relationship with Grace, plunged into thoughts about his life. He realized that his desire for novelty and excitement had led him to completely destroy his world. He could no longer count on Erica's support or friends, and this left him completely isolated. But Malik also understood that now he needed to move on, even if it would be difficult. He decided to start by regaining at least some of his lost dignity and start building his life anew. Over time, they both started moving in their new directions, but their paths no longer crossed. Grace started working on herself, trying to find ways to deal with depression and guilt. She started going to a psychologist, trying to sort out her emotions and understand how she could have made such a mistake. She still had a lot to go through, but she was determined to start a new life, even without the support of those who were dear to her. Malik found the strength to return to work and tried to build a new life on the ruins of the old one. He moved to another city, hoping that it would help him forget about the past and start over. But even in a new place, his memories of what he had lost haunted him. He understood that the path to healing would be long and thorny, but he knew that this was the only way to regain at least some sense of inner peace. As time went on, Grace and Malik continued to go their separate ways. They did not meet again and did not try to reconnect. Their romance is a thing of the past, as a painful reminder that passion and desire can destroy lives if not controlled. Each of them learned their lessons from this experience, and although their path to recovery was different, they both realized that the only way out of this chaos was to accept their mistakes and move forward. Now they had to live with the consequences of their actions, but they were no longer connected to each other. Each of them began the healing process, realizing that the path to forgiveness is not an instant decision, but a long and difficult process that takes time and effort. Their stories intertwined only for a short moment, but this moment changed their lives forever. Grace had never thought that she would ever find herself at such a depth of despair. Every morning became a struggle for her, in which she tried to find at least some support in her life, which turned into chaos. Her feelings, guilt, shame, and loss engulfed her like a huge wave, leaving only ruins in its wake. Her inner world was destroyed, and the only thing left was to try to find a way to heal, at least for herself. She knew she couldn't win George back or restore Erica's trust, but she needed to start the process of self-forgiveness in order to learn how to live again. Grace has always been a person who is used to solving problems on her own, but now she realized that it was no longer possible. She was broken by her actions and their consequences. One day, realizing that it couldn't go on like this, she decided to seek professional help. She needed to deal with her emotions, with why she had committed such a destructive act, and how she could live with it further. The first steps were especially difficult. Grace had a hard time deciding to call a psychologist, but she felt that this was the only way out. She knew she had a long and painful process ahead of her, but she was willing to go through with it. In the first session, she felt vulnerable and helpless. It seemed to her that she was opening up to a stranger the darkest corners of her soul, which she herself did not fully realize. The psychologist Grace started working with was attentive and patient. He understood that the healing process would take a long time and that it was important for Grace to gradually sort out her feelings. The first sessions were dedicated to Grace being able to talk openly about what happened. She talked about her marriage, how she felt lost and lonely in recent years, and how her affair with Malik, which seemed to her a temporary consolation, eventually led to the complete destruction of her life. Grace found it hard to accept the fact that she needed to forgive herself. Her guilt was so deep that she couldn't see how she could live with it anymore. The psychologist helped her understand that forgiving herself does not mean justifying her actions, but rather acknowledging that she made a mistake, and that, despite this, she deserves the opportunity to move forward. This process was difficult and painful, but gradually Grace began to realize that her life was not over, and that she needed to learn to live with the consequences of her actions. Each new session brought new realizations. Grace began to realize that her affair with Malik was the result of her own dissatisfaction and insecurity. She was looking for in this relationship what she lacked in her marriage to George: attention, recognition, and emotional connection. But instead of solving these problems in marriage, she chose a path that led to the destruction of everything she valued. One of the most painful topics for Grace was the loss of communication with her daughter. Erica, after learning about her mother's infidelity, completely broke off all relations with her. This was the biggest blow for Grace. She realized that she had betrayed her daughter's trust, that she had destroyed their bond, which she thought was unbreakable. Erica was her pride and joy, and now she couldn't even see her or talk to her. After several months of working with a psychologist, Grace decided that she should at least try to establish a relationship with Erica. She understood that it would be difficult and that her daughter might never forgive her, but she couldn't leave everything as it was. The psychologist suggested that she write Erica a letter in which Grace could express her feelings, her remorse and apologies. This step seemed frightening to her, but necessary. Gathering her thoughts, Grace began to write a letter several times, but each time she erased what she had written. It was difficult for her to find words that could express the depth of her remorse. She knew that no amount of words could win back Erica's trust, but she still hoped that her frankness and sincerity could at least ease their breakup a little. Finally, Grace wrote a letter in which she honestly admitted her mistakes and expressed her love for Erica. She didn't apologize, knowing that it might be too much, but she hoped that Erica would at least read it and understand what she was going through. Grace sent the letter and waited, at least for a reply, although she was not sure that she would receive it. Meanwhile, Malik was also trying to find his way to healing. After the breakdown of his marriage with Erica, he realized that he needed to radically change his life. He could no longer stay in the same city, among the same people who knew its history. Every corner, every street reminded him of his mistakes, and it became unbearable for him. He decided to move to another city, hoping that a new place and a new job would help him start from scratch. The move was his attempt to put the past behind him, although Malik understood that he would not be able to escape from his internal problems. He knew that he needed time to sort himself out and his actions, but he also understood that in a new place he would have a chance to restore his self-esteem. The new city greeted Malik coolly. He didn't know anyone, and that initially gave him a sense of freedom. No one knew his past, his mistakes, his betrayal. But it also meant that he would have to rebuild his life, which turned out to be more difficult than he thought. Malik hoped that work would help him distract himself, but every evening, returning to an empty apartment, he again faced loneliness and inner demons. Over time, Malik began to realize that the move itself would not solve his problems. He still felt guilty for what he had done, and this feeling did not disappear despite the change in the situation. He also knew that he had to work on himself to find a way to move on. Like Grace, he began seeing a psychologist, realizing that he needed professional help to cope with an internal crisis. Malik realized that his affair with Grace was the result of his own unfulfilled desire to avoid problems in his marriage with Erica. He sought solace on the side instead of working on his relationship. But now that everything was destroyed, he had to face the consequences of his actions and try to figure himself out. With each session, he became more aware that healing would be a long and difficult process. Malik knew he needed to forgive himself, but as with Grace, it wasn't easy. He began to analyze his mistakes and realize that his actions were not only the result of his dissatisfaction, but also weakness, inability to take responsibility for his life. Over time, Malik began to regain his sense of inner balance. He found a job that gave him stability and began to settle in a new city. But he knew that his path to full healing was far from over. Forgiving himself and accepting his mistakes became his main challenge, and every day he tried to take a step towards it. As time passed, Grace and Malik gradually began to find ways to live with the consequences of their actions. Each of them chose their own path to healing Grace through self-forgiveness and attempts to establish a relationship with her daughter, Malik through moving and inner work on themselves. Their lives had changed forever, but they both knew that moving forward was the only way to deal with what had happened. Both realized that they would never be able to completely forget about their mistakes, but they also began to realize that life goes on. Every day was a new challenge, and every day they learned to live with the consequences of their actions, gradually finding a way to inner peace. After the devastating end of their relationship, Grace and Malik found themselves on a difficult and long road to recovery. Their lives, completely changed because of the mistakes they made, required conscious efforts in order to move on. Each of them plunged into a deep internal crisis, realizing that they would not be able to return to their former lives. But over time, they began to find ways to deal with the guilt and try to rebuild their lives. Grace, who lost everything, family, friends, trust and respect from others, began her journey to healing through gradual acceptance of her mistakes. She continued to visit a psychologist, dealing with her emotions, learning to understand why she went on a destructive affair with Malik. At first it seemed to her that she would never be able to recover, and that the life she knew was gone forever. But over time, Grace began to realize that her life wasn't over, she just became different. Her first realization was that forgiving herself is not a quick process. It required constant effort and patience. The guilt, like a heavy load, did not go away immediately. Even when she thought she had found some peace, her consciousness brought her back to what had happened. Every time she passed by the old house where she lived with George and Erica, she felt her heart tighten with pain and regret. She knew that she had destroyed it all with her own hands, and she needed to accept it in order to move on. Over time, Grace realized that the past cannot be brought back, but she can learn to live with the consequences of her actions. She focused on rebuilding her life. Her first task was to establish a daily routine, to return to the work that had once brought her satisfaction. Although colleagues and acquaintances initially treated her with distrust, Grace gradually began to restore her professional relationships. She focused on her work, which helped her find a foothold in the new reality. One of the most difficult tasks for Grace remained her relationship with her daughter Erica. After Grace wrote her a letter of apology and revelation, there was no response. This made her feelings even worse, but she understood that Erica had every right not to forgive her. Inside, Grace continued to hope that one day, perhaps, they would be able to talk and try to restore at least some of the lost relationship. But she also realized that it would only happen when Erica was ready for it. It took several years before Grace was able to come to some kind of inner peace. She learned to live with the consequences of her actions, accepted that part of her life was lost forever, but that didn't mean she couldn't build a future anymore. She started doing charity work, helping women who were going through family crises, which gave her a sense of importance and usefulness. These new activities helped her find a new meaning in her life, and although the pain and regrets of the past still remained with her, she learned not to let them rule her life. Malik, like Grace, also went through a deep internal struggle. When he moved to a new city, he hoped to leave everything behind, but he quickly realized that the past always follows you. Despite the new living conditions, his internal crisis did not resolve itself. The move gave him space to think, but it didn't get rid of his feelings of guilt and loss. Malik, like Grace, started seeing a psychologist. During therapy, he realized that his affair with Grace was not only the result of a temporary passion, but also an attempt to escape from the underlying problems in his marriage with Erica and his own insecurity. He often came back to thinking about what he might have done differently if he had paid attention to the signals that were obvious long before he began to seek solace on the side. Malik realized that he had to be honest with himself and Erica from the very beginning, so as not to bring everything to such a catastrophe. The process of self-forgiveness was difficult for Malik. Every time he thought about Erica and the moment when she found out about the betrayal, he was overcome with deep longing. He understood that he had lost the woman he loved because of his weakness, and he knew that he would never be able to regain her trust again. But over time, thanks to the support of a psychologist and his own reflections, Malik began to understand that forgiving himself is not forgetting mistakes, but accepting that he is a human being and that all people make mistakes. Malik found solace in work and new beginnings. He started doing sports and meditation, which helped him find balance and inner peace. Gradually, his life began to take on a new shape, although the memories of the past did not leave him. He also tried to build new relationships. Although each time it was difficult for him, the fear of repeating his mistakes haunted him. But Malik realized that each new step was important for his healing. It took several years before Malik felt that he could start his life anew. He did not forget about his mistakes, but he learned to live with them. He understood that his past would always be a part of him, but that shouldn't stop him from building a future. Malik began to spend more time communicating with new friends, opening up to people, although it required a lot of effort from him. He learned anew to trust and be honest with himself and others. For Malik, this process was even more difficult because of the loss of respect from friends and colleagues who had once been a part of his life. In the new city, he tried to build new social connections, but past mistakes left a deep mark on his soul. Nevertheless, over time, he found his place in a new environment and began to appreciate the lessons he learned from his mistakes. As a result, both Grace and Malik went through years of pain, introspection, and recovery. They both realized that their affair was a mistake that led to the destruction of their lives and the lives of those who were dear to them. But they also realized that this experience helped them get to know themselves, their weaknesses, and their motives better. This hard path has taught them responsibility and the need to be honest both with themselves and with others. And although their paths no longer crossed, they both learned to live with what happened. Grace has rebuilt a part of her life, finding new meanings in helping others and working on herself. Malik found peace in his new hobbies and social life, gradually accepting himself and his mistakes. Now, years after the end of their relationship, they could look back with the realization that their lives had changed forever, but that this change was a lesson for them and an opportunity to start over. They were no longer the people who had once allowed emotions to ruin their lives. Now each of them was stronger, wiser, and ready to build a new life this time with an understanding of their weaknesses and responsibility for their actions.